Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for turning out today. We're going to run through a lot of the issues around waste to energy, as so-called, trash incineration, and what the problems are with it, and talk a little bit about alternatives. So first, I'll just say Energy Justice Network is a national organization. We've been around for about 25 years now. We're based in Philadelphia, but are working with folks all across the country, from Hawaii to Oregon to Florida to New England and lots of points in between, particularly with a focus on waste incineration of all sorts. Now, we have a lot of information on our website, energyjustice.net/incineration. You'll find fact sheets and reports and such, and there's a lot more that we don't have online yet that you can see through things in this presentation, or follow up with me if you need specific information. We probably have stuff that isn't on our website yet. So we also have a mapping project. We'd recently relocated it to ejmap.org. And this is one slice from it where you can see where the operating commercial scale trash incinerators are in the US. This is the most recent map where we've taken the two that have closed so far this year off the map. So this is the 64 that are still operating in the US, and we have some in Canada on here as well. And you can see there's a bit of a trend. It's basically Virginia to Maine plus Minnesota and Florida is the geography of nearly all the incinerators in the nation. And we are doing our best to help communities that want our support anywhere in the country to get these shut down and to prevent new ones of all sorts as well. Now, the most recent number of operating trash incinerators as of about a month ago, with the closure of the Portsmouth, Virginia trash incinerator that we've been anticipating for a few years now and looking at, we're down to 64. And so this is a trend line that our goal is to get this down to 0 as soon as possible, hopefully within 10 years. So we have to close about 6 of them per year to make sure that happens. And we're looking forward to working with you all to effectuate that. Now, the lifespan of trash incinerators, there are now 52 that have closed since 2000. And their average age at closure was just 25 years. However, most of them are now in their 30s. There are 6 that made it past 40 years old. One of them burned down last year in Florida, but there are 2 more turning 40 later this year. And they're well past their prime. So the entire industry is really past its primes. There's only one actual new one, and that's one of the ones in Florida. The rest of them are getting pretty old, except for some that have expanded or been rebuilt. And due to the high cost and community opposition, there has not been a single new trash incinerator built at a new site since 1995, since Montgomery County, Maryland got built, despite hundreds of attempts to build new ones. So that is a credit to many of you in this room and others who have helped work to stop new ones from being built. The track record for stopping them is basically 100%. So that's encouragement for those of you, like I see one of my friends here in Sullivan County on the screen, and I know they're being targeted with one in New York. You can be encouraged by the fact that you have basically 100% chance of winning if you get organized and do the right things to stop them from building new ones. There are new ones being planned in Florida due to massive subsidies at the state level. Connecticut is also trying. Most other places have given up, but there are still places that explore it and usually fail to do so. Now, there are a lot of terms used for trash incinerators of various sorts. Usually they're using waste to energy, or WTE, which is a misnomer that I'll debunk in a minute. The industry has also rebranded a lot to call themselves energy from waste and flip those terms around. And there's a whole debate in their conferences about whether to call it one or the other. And lots of other euphemisms. Trash to steam, when I first got involved in this around 1990, that's what it was being called. And I thought, oh, gee, if they can turn trash into steam, that's a great idea. But obviously, we're not just throwing ice cubes in our trash, so it's not just water vapor coming out. And there are a lot of other terms that you should look out for, including integrated, which a lot of times you see that as a code word that essentially means a waste plan that includes incineration. And they often will hide their intentions behind code words like integrated. So they used to call it trash to steam. I like to rebrand this and say it's actually toxic trash, sorry, trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions. That's literally what's happening. Yes, there was steam coming out, but there was a lot more coming out as well. We also like to rebrand waste to energy to waste of energy. because as we saw in a study many years ago, the last time I saw it studied, if you recycle and compost the same materials that we destroy when we incinerate them, you save 3 to 5 times more energy than you can get back by burning it, because that energy value is not all physically present in the waste. If you think about paper, for example, the energy it takes to cut down trees, to ship them to a paper mill, to burn trash or tires, sorry, not trash, coal usually, or tires sometimes, in a paper mill to power it, then to ship it to a Staples, all these different steps, a lot of them don't need to be repeated if you recycle that paper. And so you save all that energy from having to be spent if you're recycling it, instead of trying to get that back from burning what's left in that paper, which doesn't include a lot of that embodied energy anymore. So there are additional trends where this industry is going. They know that they can't really get away with building conventional new trash incinerators, but there are increasing proposals for other types. So you see a lot of things that are under the refuse-derived fuel category, where they try to take trash and turn it into burnable pellets to burn in a cement kiln or some other types of facility. You also see a lot of proposals for waste to fuels technologies, where they're trying to turn waste into liquid fuels to burn in airplanes or in cars. We see a lot of what we call two-stage incinerators, or used to call them incinerators in disguise, like pyrolysis, gasification, and plasma arc. These are experimental ones that generally don't work and cost even more money, but they still have a lot of companies pushing them pretty hard throughout the country. And other ones that are not quite incinerators, but anaerobic digestion, where instead of burning it, they burn the gases that come off of basically composting it in a vessel. And there are some problems with that, but it could be done appropriately if they're using it to pre-process waste before a landfill. And we'll get into that when we talk about what zero waste looks like. So these experimental kinds, especially these gasification, pyrolysis, plasma arc ones, they can't run continuously. They have not managed to scale up to commercial scale, despite some attempts at that. They cannot operate on heterogeneous feedstocks like trash. Some of them have had a hard time even operating on tires, because tires are too heterogeneous for this technology to work. So as consistent as you'd think tires would be, even that has had problems. Oftentimes you see it proposed by companies with no real history, companies that put a fancy looking website together, bamboozle some politicians into thinking it's a good idea, run and get patents and say they're the first one with that type of the spin on the technology. And usually they lie and say there's zero emissions, zero waste, have no smokestack, and then they tend to fall apart, where you find that those things are just not true when it comes around time to see if they're applying for permits, and gee, they have a smokestack now. Okay. One of the ways that they will fight us when they talk about pyrolysis facilities, and specifically, they say we are not incinerators. Gasification ones too, they say we're not incinerator, and they will fall on their sword over that. And yet the federal definition of a municipal waste combustor, which EPA has stated multiple times is synonymous with municipal waste incinerator. They don't like the I word. They even call it the I word in their conferences. But they try to avoid that word because people know it's a bad word. Yet the federal definition of what is essentially, EPA says, an incinerator includes pyrolysis and gasification. And the Trump administration tried to change this, tried to exempt it from these regulations. And last year in June, EPA decided to keep regulating these as waste incinerators, which is one argument we should push back on. If they say they're not an incinerator, you say, well, actually, you're regulated as one. EPA says you are one. So for all we're concerned right now, you're still an incinerator. Now, I've made the argument that trash incinerators are the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. So there are actually 4 arguments there I'm going to walk you through. One of them is whether it's the most expensive way to manage waste or not. And the head of the Incinerator Industries Trade Association, which changed their name, I think, a 4th time in the past year, but they used to be called the Energy Recovery Council. Ted Michaels used to be the president. And when I was testifying, sitting right next to him before DC City Council about 11 years ago, he admitted on the record, it's on video on their government website, that incinerators are more expensive than landfills. Of course, he calls them waste to energy, but he says almost every case you're going to find the landfill is cheaper. And we find this backed up by other industry trade associations. Now, this one, they haven't repeated this or updated this data in about 10 years because they did a national analysis and it's very regional, so they stopped tracking it this way. But for as long as they have tracked it, you can see that incineration was far more expensive than landfilling. We see this in other data that's more locally specific as well. And on the energy side of things, when they pretend they're about energy production, we see that trash incineration is the most expensive way to make energy. This is the latest data, and the industry likes to say, Mike uses old data. Well, sometimes the latest data is old because they haven't updated anything. So in this case, the latest data that the Energy Information Administration put out that included trash incineration was 2012 data. And that's because there are no new incinerators really being built since then. You got that one in Florida at an existing site, but they dropped incinerators out of their series of reports because no one's really building them. So the last time they did study it, they found that's the most expensive to build and the most expensive to operate and maintain of all the forms of energy production that they looked at that are actually getting built. And there are some advanced nuclear things that are not happening that were a little more expensive. Same with certain types of coal with carbon sequestration and such. Even that is cheaper in that slide, but sometimes they manage to be more expensive. But in general, anything that's actually happening in real life, trash incineration is as expensive as it gets on energy. And that's one of the main reasons why it's not succeeding as an industry. It's very capital intensive to build. They require long-term monopoly contracts, usually with what we call put or pay clauses that basically say if you don't give them a certain amount of waste, you pay them as if you did, which punishes recycling and composting or any other types of zero waste strategies. They also compete with energy alternatives because in a lot of states, they qualify as a renewable energy source, and they compete sometimes directly with wind and solar, or at least with hydro, depending on the structure of the law. And these incentives, basically, they're competing with the clean options on the waste sector and the energy sector at the same time. So that's part of why they're so problematic. There are a lot of subsidies that get thrown at it, and I know some groups right now are working on pushing back against IRS tax credits that would be going to this industry. There are also a lot of examples. I won't walk through them all on this slide, but you can see there are a lot of places where cities like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Detroit went bankrupt in part, or in Harrisburg's case, almost completely because of their incinerators. There are others that have tried to go bankrupt, like in Claremont, New Hampshire, but were not allowed to and had to pay the incinerator for the waste they didn't send them. So there are just a lot of examples where this has been a disaster economically for communities. And we used to think that incineration competes with recycling. We used to think that they need things that burn well, like paper and plastics. And maybe that was true at one point, but we're finding that that's changing, that they actually compete more with composting now. And I've had the operator of the Baltimore incinerator admit this to me on a tour, and I've seen that's Wheelbrader, now Win Waste. But their competitor Cavanta, which is now Reworld, also expressed the same thing on some of their other facilities. I'm sorry, let's make sure everyone's muted. So what they admitted to me is that they have a certain amount of BTUs, energy value they can put through their boiler at a given time. And if they have too much plastic in there, they exceed that limit, which means they can't feed more waste. So they like the wet stuff. They like the compostables because it cools down their incinerators so they can feed more waste. So it's a little counterintuitive from what we used to think, but it's interesting to hear that admitted from some of these companies. Either way, they're competing with things that are better to do with waste, which is not make them be waste and recycle and compost them after source separation. So okay, let's move on to other economic angles. They're the worst way to create jobs, and this is one of the analyses that Institute for Local Self-Reliance has done some years ago. They have some newer ones that focus on Maryland with composting and found similar results, that landfilling and incineration are the worst ways to produce jobs. With waste, the best things you can do is to reuse things, or after that, recycle them. You get about 5 to 10 times more jobs with recycling and composting. The more detailed analysis shows up to 300 times more jobs with electronics and computer reuse, and a lot of in between numbers on different types of things. In typical recycling, the MRFs, they call them, material recovery facilities, you get about 10 times more jobs than the one job per that amount of waste that you get if you incinerate or landfill. All right, so how does it compare to other energy sources in terms of pollution? Well, we've done this analysis a few times. The latest is with EPA's 2018 data. And we found, looking at the whole nation here, that trash incineration is far more polluting for most pollutants than coal burners, even though they tend to be newer facilities with more pollution control equipment on them than coal power plants have. And even after those controls, they're putting out more pollution than a coal plant would for making the same amount of energy. Now, lest you think we maybe aren't able to do a good analysis of EPA's data on our own, you can rely on New York State government having done the same kind of analysis. They did that back in 2011 and found the same kind of results, except for sulfur dioxide, where coal was worse. They compared the 10 trash incinerators that are all still operating to the 8 coal plants that all shut down since then, but used to be operating at that time. And they found that the trash incinerators are far more polluting than the coal plants. In terms of mercury, it was 14 times more pollution per unit of energy produced. But the real issue is not how they compare to energy facilities, it's how they compare to other waste facilities like landfills. And the industry was quick to point this out when, at that same meeting where I was testifying next to their mouthpiece in DC, they said, oh, it's not fair to compare us to coal power plants. Waste to energy plant is designed as a solid waste facility. Electricity is a secondary function. That was the only way they can squirm out of this comparison to coal plants, even though they name themselves Energy Recovery Council, and they always try to talk about as if they're power plants, not waste facilities, especially when they're trying to get subsidies, credits, or exemptions. So how do they compare to other types of, well, actually, sorry, the slides probably should have been before that one. One more on comparing to energy. You can see on the global warming emissions, they're 65% worse than coal per unit of energy, but they have a lot of acrobatics where they pretend that a lot of those emissions don't count, the biogenic fraction in orange, and they have a lot of creative math that subtracts these to the point where they actually pretend they have negative emissions, which is kind of ludicrous, but that's something the industry consistently claims. Now, I'll come back to the comparison of landfills. I think I have a few other slides before I hit those. So dioxins are the most toxic chemicals known to science. EPA actually has a database showing how toxic different chemicals are, and it turns out that the most toxic form of dioxin, the one illustrated here in the corner, is literally 140,000 times more toxic than mercury. And mercury, there's no safe dose of that either. So this is the most toxic chemical known to science. It causes all sorts of health problems, so many that if I listed them all, it wouldn't fit on the slide. And most of our exposure to them is not from living next to the incinerator, but it's from eating meat and dairy products, because it loves fat and hates water so much that it climbs up the food chain very rapidly. This chart here is actually from an EPA report they never finalized, even though it came out in the early 90s, because there's just so much of an impact on agriculture, on the industry, that they're scared to finalize and put this report out. But this is how you get exposed to the most toxic chemicals known to science. They start at incinerators or even forest fires and burn barrels and other sources. Mostly incinerators is one of the main sources, though. And almost all the ways you get exposed are meat and dairy products. It doesn't like water, so it's negligible, according to EPA, how much you get that way. So how do we make sure that smokestacks of any sort, not just trash incinerators, are properly regulated? Well, first, you need strong protective standards. You need continuous emissions monitoring, and you need aggressive enforcement. And all three of those chain links in this country are broken. So I want to walk you through what I call the smokestack story, where pretty much anywhere you go in the country, I get calls from Kansas and random places all over, and people say, help me fight this thing. And one of the things I'll sometimes ask them is, did you hear this kind of story? And they're like, yeah, how did you know? That's exactly what they said, because the story is similar everywhere. What you hear oftentimes is, don't worry, be happy. We have continuous emissions monitors that are on our smokestack. We know what's coming out at all times. The state will have the information, and the state is a very aggressive enforcer. And so they'll fine us very heavily if we go over those limits. And the limits mean that it's healthy and safe. So if we're within those limits, you can trust that it's not going to hurt you. Now, this is something that Covanta, now Reworld, often puts as fact sheets on all their facilities. They'll even say, oh, our standard is up here and our actual emissions are way down here. We're 90-some% below the standard. Therefore, what are you worried about? You know, it's all fine. So I'm going to walk you through how to debunk that. I'm going to go backwards through some of those talking points and start with the idea that they're not always within permit limits. Oftentimes, they're violating those limits and they pay fines to the state. Sometimes you'll go into a state agency's records and look it up, and you'll find routine times that there are violations. They pay a check to the state, and then there's another check another quarter, and it's just a routine business expense for them. And the fines are not enough to change behavior, even when one of the ones that I live in Philadelphia, surrounded by the worst cluster of incinerators in the nation. There are 5 of them. One of them, the one that's north of me, Covanta Plymouth, they got fined $218,000 a few years ago for routine violations they were having that are due to malfunctions that have been going on for about 5 years. That was a big fine for the agency, but about 3 days of tipping fee revenue for the company. And they've continued in the past 2 years to have the same malfunctions happening because the fines are not enough to change their behavior. It costs too much to actually do something that causes those problems to go away in their case. Now, they can also not meet modern limits, especially for the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks. Except for the one incinerator, that's the new one in West Palm Beach, Florida. Any other of the 63 remaining incinerators that we have, if they were built today, subject to modern standards, they will be illegal to operate right now because none of them can meet the requirement for nitrogen oxide emissions. We find that the emissions limits are also different for older facilities than new ones. So since all but one are classified as old facilities, they have looser limits. And the limits are stronger in other countries as well, especially in Europe. And in the US, they're supposed to update those standards every 5 years, but had to be sued by environmental groups to update their standards for existing and new trash incinerators. And those new standards that they're finally coming out with are not going to be in effect until 2028 or 9, which means a 23, not a 5-year gap in updating standards. Now, the permit limits are also not based on health and safety. We've had multiple state and environmental engineer people at agencies, environmental agencies say, and one of them we have on record, even on video, saying that it has nothing to do with health and safety. It's a technology-based standard. And one of the ways we know this is that permit limits are concentration-based. So if you look at the permits, everything is in parts per million or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. They're all per something. So if you have a 500 ton per day trash incinerator, they'll be allowed to put a certain amount of pollution out. But if you have the biggest one in the country, which is one of the other 5 near me, which is 3,500 tons per day, well, that's 7 times more pollution that they're allowed to put out because they're a bigger plant. So that's just how permits are written in this country. It's not like there's some safe dose that they can't exceed. It's just a concentration-based limit in a permit that's technology-based. And so if it costs too much for them to do more aggressive air controls, then they just don't have to do it under a lot of these regulations. Now, we also know that they don't always follow the rules. We've seen examples with Covanta in particular, where they've rigged stack tests, their once-a-year stack testing, by stockpiling waste that burns cleaner, like cardboard, and using that on their one test a year for most pollutants, where they say, this is what we're like all year, when that's not true. That's actually illegal. The same company has been caught tampering with their continuous emissions monitors to make it look like their emissions are lower than they actually are. That was in Connecticut a few decades ago, and there are probably other examples where they haven't been caught and busted, but that's the one I'm aware of where they were. And there's no safe dose of a lot of the chemicals they're putting out, including lead, mercury, dioxins, radiation, fine particulate matter. So it doesn't matter how much they're putting out, it can still hurt you, even if it's within the limits. But the real place where the emperor wears no clothes, and where I like to question these companies when they take people on tours, they'll bring you to the operations room and say, look at all these fancy monitors, it looks like a NASA control room, and you think, gee, they really know what they're doing. They have a lot of bells and whistles. Well, ask them, which pollutants do you continuously monitor? Then they fall apart because you find out only 3 pollutants in most cases are continuously monitored, none of the toxic ones, and they're underestimating the pollution when they do this. So the analogy that I like to make with this is if we regulated speeding in this country for regulated motorists by allowing them to drive all year with no speedometer in their car, and once a year on the highway, there will be a speed trap set, and there'll be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And then the brother of the driver is running the speed trap because they hire their own consultants to do the testing. That is literally how most pollutants at any facility with a smokestack in this country are regulated. They know the test is coming up. They're even allowed to, in some cases, change their operating conditions to do things like run their pollution controls harder during the test in order to make their emissions lower and pretend that that's what they're doing all the time. So there are about 3 pollutants that they continuously monitor at all plants. That's sulfur dioxide or sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and carbon monoxide. The bigger ones also are doing carbon dioxide, and then a few other things that aren't pollutants, like opacity, oxygen, and temperature. But what we find is that when they use continuous monitoring technology, the rare cases that this happens, the emissions are actually higher than they're telling us when they test once a year. The biggest incinerator in the country is one of those ones I mentioned near me in Chester, Pennsylvania, where they have continuous emissions monitors for hydrochloric acid. And they also do annual stack tests. So I crunched the numbers and found out that their continuous monitors are showing us that their actual emissions are 62% higher than the once a year test, which is what pretty much every other incinerator community in the country gets. If you go to Europe and look at some of the studies they've done on continuous sampling of dioxin and furan emissions, the most toxic chemicals known to science, one of them found the actual emissions are 30 to 50 times higher than what we think they are in the US when we test once per year. Another study up to nearly 1,300 times higher than what we're being told here. So the technology can exist to continuously monitor many other pollutants, but outside of places where in local ordinances that I've written, we've gotten some passed in a few states that raise the bar and require this, it's not being required. We have one that's now at a state level in Oregon, where Covanta is now being required to test 9 different metals on a continuous basis, as well as dioxins, furans, and PCBs. However, they managed to squirm out of the latter requirement and will not be testing those continuously in violation of state law. In Hawaii, is a good example. We based this on the law we got passed in Oregon with some of the folks here in the room. So thank you to those that I've been working with, some of our member groups. But similar to that Covanta incinerator is the one in Honolulu, where in green you see what they continuously monitor, the few pollutants that happens for. In yellow, you see ones that they monitor once per year. Red are the ones that they never monitor, and they have some differences in their units. So some are orange here, just to clarify that. But we're trying to get a bill passed that makes them all have to be continuously monitored, since the technology exists for that. And so we can basically undress the emperor and find out how much we're really being exposed to, because we only know honest numbers, assuming they're not tampering with their devices, for the ones in green that they typically test continuously. All right, let's talk about ash for a second. Incinerators don't come without landfills. They still require landfills for their ash, unless they're doing something really irresponsible, where some places, like in my home county near Philadelphia, where they are trying to recycle that ash into roads, and they're trying to do that now in Hawaii, and they've tried in some other places. I think Long Island is also being threatened with that right now. And so that's even more dangerous, because then there's not even an attempt to protect the groundwater. You just have linear unlined landfills that you get to drive over and spread toxic ash particles everywhere. But even when you put them in a landfill, so for every 100 tons you burn, you get about 30 tons of this toxic ash, and the ash will leach more readily. The reason we have coffee beans on this slide is that it's an analogy that if we pour water over coffee beans, you're not going to get coffee, right? But if you increase the surface area by grinding them up, now you can get coffee. More things can leach out of it. It's the same thing with ash versus trash. So if we take a cell phone and chuck it into a landfill, it's going to take a long time until those toxic metals or other chemicals can reach you in a way that you can eat, breathe, or drink. But if you let that be burned instantly, about 70% is now up in the air. And the rest of it is now fine particles that can blow off of trucks. And often it's used as landfill cover, which used to mean you cover things to prevent the community from being exposed to waste at night. However, they allow waste now to be used in place of soil as daily cover. So you can have ash being cover for itself. And we've seen examples where that's been documented to blow off of the landfill site into the community, meaning that people can ingest and inhale these particles. And the ash testing is not even based on that type of exposure. It's only based on what leaches out under certain pHs, and they chemically rig the test to make sure that it never comes up hazardous. Otherwise, it would cost the industry so much they'd be shut down overnight, paying for hazardous waste disposal costs for their ash. Okay, so here's what I was indicating earlier we got to. Sorry, it was not where I thought it was. But the comparison of incinerators to landfills is a key one. And I think we need to be able to win this argument, and we can and should be winning this argument. But we just have a lot of confused public officials that know landfills are bad and incinerators are magic waste to energy facilities that make things disappear. And as long as they think that, we're in trouble. So there's science now to show that incineration is clearly worse than landfilling. And so I want to walk you through that in a minute. And of course, the comparison is not a landfill versus incinerator, but a landfill versus both, because you get a smaller but more toxic landfill with an incinerator. And the real alternative, of course, is zero waste and minimal landfilling. So if we look at this comparison versus ash landfilling with incinerator, there are a number of ways we can compare them. So there are 9 different environmental and health criteria that we look at in the study results I'm about to share. We've also done separate research looking at cost, jobs, the number of people impacted, and the race and class demographics of those impacted. Incinerators lose on all those arguments as well. But right now we're going to focus on the health and environmental ones. And we're going to do that using what's called the MEBCalc tool, which is the Measuring Environmental Benefits Calculator, which measures a lot more than other models that look, for example, at EPA's WARM model that looks only at global warming and has a few big flaws in it that make incinerators come out looking better. We're working on getting EPA to change that. But we're looking at the most comprehensive tool so that we can really look at this in a better way. And this tool was used in a zero waste plan that we got put together for Delaware County, Pennsylvania, where they have the largest waste incinerator in the country, the one in Chester, Pennsylvania. And part of that study, I made sure in the county's RFP for it, that they had the consultants do this sort of life cycle analysis. So this here is the result of that analysis. You'll see that the incineration line, which is the tall one here, compared to the landfill where the ash normally goes, this is the scenario that if they sent the trash directly there instead of ash, per ton of waste, this is not what you actually pay in terms of waste bills. This is the additional cost when you monetize the climate and health impacts on top of what people are paying in their waste bills or their tax bills. So you have an additional $337 per ton of damage to health and environment, most of which is climate impacts in blue. But in brown, you also have the heart attacks and strokes caused by particulate matter released. In red, you have the birth defects and cancers caused by toxic chemicals that are released. In yellow, you have the asthma attacks that are triggered by the nitrogen oxides that form ground level ozone or smog. And you get those from landfills too, but you see they're very thin lines. Even if you do the subtractions that you typically have in a life cycle analysis that says, well, somewhere else, they're not burning as much natural gas because the incinerator is making energy, and they pull some metals out of the ash. So somewhere else, they're not getting hurt because they don't have metals mining. Great. Okay. So you can look at that, and this is not what that community faces, but in the overall big picture, you can bring their damage level down to here, and it still is far worse than going to a landfill, even including the transportation, which is part of this analysis, but is a very small portion of it, as you'll see in a minute. Now, the 2 other takeaway charts from this study. One of them looked at the total amount of harm. So this is not per ton. This is the total amount of damage caused by the current system versus the zero waste system we're proposing. So we're looking at $104 million of damage per year in 2021 caused by the existing system of burning trash at the incinerator in Chester, Pennsylvania, versus 16 if they adopted the zero waste plan, which means end incineration and reduce waste through all the different zero waste measures in that plan. Now, the benefits currently are close to $400 a ton in terms of the avoided harm that is not happening because of the recycling and any composting or source reduction that's already going on. That is worth even more. But if they adopt the zero waste plan, it basically doubles that benefit, the avoided harms, by getting even more waste to not be waste. So the third and one of the more striking parts of this analysis, I think, is this look at the transportation impacts. So this chart is a little confusing. I'll walk you through it. What you just saw on the other ones, the blue part is now the black part. That's the global warming pollution. All the other health and environmental impacts are in gray. And they did this analysis to see how much the landfill gas capture rate matters in these first three bars. So even if they capture none of their landfill gas, they're still not quite as bad as burning the trash. But usually they're capturing about 75%. And if you ask any landfill, they'll tell you 75%. So we're looking at the landfill here and the incinerator here. And the collection trucks, the red, those are the same. You still have to have a truck going to your house. But the truck that goes between the transfer stations that those collection trucks drop waste off at, and the either going to the incinerator close to home or the landfill 2 counties away. Oftentimes you have politicians that say, oh, diesel trucks are horrible. You don't want to have to truck that waste all the way to a landfill 2 counties or even 700 miles away in some cases that we've analyzed, because those dirty diesel trucks are so bad that we should use the incinerator close to home instead of using the faraway landfill. I hear that argument, especially in Connecticut and other places where they're trying to defend their use of incineration. And yet you look at this and you see the nonsense that actually represents, because in this case, the hauling impacts are that tiny little yellow sliver versus hauling it 1.5 to 2 hours away to a landfill where you have a little thicker yellow sliver. It still comes nowhere close to the difference between landfilling and incineration. There's no distance you can drive a truck in the continental US that can catch up and make incineration close to home justified compared to any distance you have to haul it to get to a landfill. This here is an even better slide to illustrate that. This is from a similar analysis that we did in Montgomery County, Maryland. And you see the incinerator in red and the transportation using a rail-based system here in black versus several other landfill options where all the impacts, this is just the global warming impacts in this case. The previous slide was all of them. But you can see the CO2 impacts with the landfill, and the blue is trucking, the black is if it's by rail. So yeah, rail's a tiny bit better, but there's no way to justify using an incinerator close to home because this blue line is somehow so much worse to be trucking it hundreds of miles to that landfill because it doesn't come close to catching up to the incinerator. And it's important for public officials to really absorb and understand this. Okay, so let's talk about health impacts for a minute. Now, I won't walk you through all in this slide, but you can get this in the follow-up. There are a lot of pollutants that come out of incinerators, and a lot of different health impacts that each one of them causes. When you look at studies of health around trash incinerators, Covanta in particular has put out claims. They say incinerators have been studied and comprehensively, and there are no health impacts. So they say all the studies show that there are no health impacts from living next to incinerators. And that's not true. I've dug into their footnotes, and the footnotes are their footnotes, and some are misrepresented, and some are just, they're not using the latest data on some of it. But what you find is that, of course, in the US, they're not doing comprehensive studies much at all anyway, but a lot of the studies that you can find out of Europe, where they do find health impacts, find increases in cancers. They find increases in cancers generally, as well as increases in specific cancers that are mentioned here. You also, in some of the studies, will find respiratory diseases, cardiovascular, and urinary diseases elevated in communities around trash incinerators. And it's not a surprise that there are studies that don't find this, because pollution travels, it gets into food travels, people move. There are lots of things that water down the impacts, including other polluters. So it's not easy to have a study that's designed well to actually show that they found a connection, because it can just be very complicated to do these studies at all. But the fact that there have been some that have found connections is telling. Okay, let's look at environmental justice for a minute. Now, with trash incinerators, it's one of the more pronounced environmental racism trends that we've seen in any industry that we've analyzed. The only one that was significantly worse is for uranium mining for indigenous people. It's a terrible disparity. But with trash incinerators, you see a big disparity for Black communities like this one here in Chester, where I worked with these two young women years ago when we captured this photo. And what we find is that the narrative is not as easy as some claim. So sometimes you'll hear claims like 80% of incinerators are in environmental justice communities, and that is just not correct. What we find, if we do the analysis properly, use not just the latest census data and the latest data on which incinerators are even open, but even if we go back some years, the analysis isn't too different. We find currently that 63% of the commercial scale trash incinerators that are operating today are in majority white communities. So this doesn't mean that there's not environmental racism. It's just a little bit more nuanced than that. We find that the largest incinerators are in more urban communities, which, because of the number of people impacted, causes the entire industry to disproportionately impact people of color, especially Black people. And what we find is if we look at the largest 25 incinerators, the majority of them, 15, 16, depending on whether you count West Palm Beach as one or two facilities, are in communities of color, where people of color are a majority. Now, trash incinerators in these communities are surrounded by 2.5 times more people and are also twice as large as those in white communities. So you have examples like in Connecticut, where there are currently 4 incinerators left. There used to be a 5th one in Hartford, closed a few years ago. And each of the 3 small ones that are in rural or smaller, not all rural, one's the city, but still less populated white communities, those 3 incinerators combined are not as large as the one that's operating in the city of Bridgeport, or as the one that used to be operating in the city of Hartford, where they're trying to reopen it right now. So that's what environmental racism looks like. It's not as simple as counting the number of incinerators and who they're impacting. You have to adjust for size and population and understand who's being impacted and how much to see the environmental racism trend that is pretty clear in this industry. And if you look at the biggest player in the industry, Cambanta, over half of their incinerators are in communities where they're disproportionately impacting people of color. In other words, the white non-Hispanic population is under 60%, or actually under 58-ish%. We also approved this through an industry-wide analysis. This is a little complicated, but I'll explain how this works. These are the distances in aggregate from all the different incinerators in the country. And if they were distributed equally, it would all follow the race ratio of 1. But what you find is that at most distances, Black people are most disproportionately impacted, and white people are less impacted than if things were fairly distributed. So this is how we know and have analyzed this and other industries by building the tools that can really analyze it and speak with confidence what's happening in these industries. And it's not about class either. We find that, oh, sorry, I thought this was the class slide. I dropped the wrong slide in here. But if we look at it by class, you find that the average income around trash incinerators is close to the average and slightly above average. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but as a whole industry, there's not a class-based argument industry-wide. And even just in terms of the white population, it's less impacted than it should be if things were fair, because otherwise it would be around 60%. Okay, let's talk about solutions for a minute, then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So zero waste is defined to be very explicit that burning waste is not allowed. This is when we redefined the international definition of zero waste in 2018. So that wasn't 3 paragraphs, but we made it a little bit more succinct and made it clear that it's not putting landfilling and incineration on the same level, that it's more important to avoid incineration because we understand the science shows that they're much more dangerous than using landfills directly. And people, especially public officials, they say, well, zero waste is this utopic crazy talk. We live in the real world. We have to actually bring the truck somewhere. So they sometimes have a negative response to the idea of zero waste. But operationally, it means zero incineration and achieving at least 90% or greater diversion from landfills or other forms of destructive disposal. The goal is to get as close to zero as you can. We're not going to hit literal zero, but it's kind of like a lot of other policies that we have with zero in them. We have zero drug tolerance, zero accidents in the workplace, zero safety defects. Like, what CEO out there is going to announce at their annual meeting that our goal this year is to injure 5 workers? They'd be left out of the room, right? But we do this with waste all the time by saying our recycling goal is 35% or 60%. So how much waste are you for if you're not trying to get to zero? So that's the point of zero waste. And there are a lot of tactics. We won't get into all of them, but happy to do a Q&A on it. These are just 3 of the bigger ones that can take big chunks of the weight out of the waste stream quickly, especially what they call pay-as-you-throw or unit-based pricing, where you pay per bag or per bin. Also, deconstruction is important to reduce construction demolition waste, which is one of the biggest waste streams as well. And I just want to share some fun slides on the first one, the pay-as-you-throw. Usually when you adopt it, you see about a 40% or 44% on average reduction in the amount of waste put out at the curb per person. And the best study is actually in Sanford, Maine, where they found a similar thing. Now, the bar doesn't start at 0, so don't be fooled by the scale here, but they still found a large drop as soon as they adopted it. And someone in that town didn't like it. He had just won the lottery, actually. And so he put up billboards and campaigned against it and got it repealed. And so when they got it repealed, it bounced back up, not all the way, but it bounced up. And then when that guy eventually moved out of town and people were like, why don't we try doing that again? It jumped down even more. So this is the best case study. And there are others as well, showing that this is the most effective and cost-effective way to quickly reduce the waste stream, to make sure people are paying per bag or per bin. And it doesn't necessarily increase illegal dumping or discriminate against poor people or make people think there's a tax increase if you just roll it out the right way. Those are the main things that politicians will jump to and say, oh, that can't work because of X, Y, Z. There are answers to all of that. And we're happy to put you in touch with folks who can get things implemented properly. There's also the exciting aspect that when you do this, you reduce waste as well. People start paying attention to what they buy. So it's not just material moving to the recycling bin from the trash bin. It's less stuff that's being produced in terms of waste in the first place. So let's talk about a few things we're doing on the federal level before we reach the end of the slides here. So a couple of years ago, we had 274 groups sign on to a letter we did to EPA. And we're asking, actually, sorry, this was to the White House Council on Environmental Quality with a copy to EPA and to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, asking for a number of reforms in terms of EPA's pro-incinerator policies. And I won't go through all of this, but some of them are being worked on in terms of the new standards. Other groups have already sued over that, and that's being developed, but not as strong as they should be. I think 8 out of 9 pollutants, they picked the weakest standard they can update it to. We're trying to close a number of loopholes, including one that's around the toxic release inventory, where this industry has been exempt since the 80s, when there started to be a toxic release inventory, from reporting their toxic emissions. And so we have a formal rulemaking petition with the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. And we have over 300 groups that signed on in support of that, petitioning EPA formally to make incinerators have to start reporting these emissions. And just a number of other things that we're asking EPA ultimately to do, and just working and chipping away at some of these at a time. This is just some news coverage from when we got that out there. And one of the things that we've had some success in so far, is a tiny shred of success so far. We're still moving toward this, but we want to revisit EPA's waste hierarchy. Their waste hierarchy says that incineration, which they call energy recovery, is better than landfilling, which they call disposal, as if incineration is not a form of disposal, which it is. But in July 2022, we got EPA to at least put a disclaimer on this. So everywhere you see this hierarchy, which is copied by cities and counties and states all over, there's now a disclaimer on EPA's website under each picture of the hierarchy that says that they're revisiting this. We got EPA to admit, leading up to this, that they have 0 citations backing up the notion that incineration is better than landfilling, yet they wouldn't revise this hierarchy yet, but they're going to do that after some other steps we're pushing them through, which is to revisit their life cycle assessment model for greenhouse gases. So this is what it should look like. We'd like to get them to a point where it actually reflects the zero waste hierarchy, which says that incineration is unacceptable, landfilling is the backstop, and that after you produce waste, you go through a couple other steps. You do material recovery, where you pull extra recyclables out. You stabilize the organics, like with an anaerobic digestion process, and then you'll have a smaller, stable landfill that won't be so gassy and stinky. This is basically the same idea, just kind of organized a little bit differently, where you can see we should research and see what's left first, and then do these other steps. And that source separation is what leads to pulling reusables out, as well as recyclables, compostables, and then the rest is the waste. And basically, in every case, the back end is a landfill. Even if we're burning, we're putting toxic ash in a landfill, but direct landfilling is less harmful. And the zero waste approach with a digestion stabilization process before the landfill is the least bad option for what we have left over. So a couple of things in terms of the way we approach our activism. First, I've learned that it's very dangerous to couple anti-incinerator activism with zero waste work in a way that links the two. We've had local officials say, we will close our incinerator once we reach zero waste, or once we get 80% reduction. And in that case, you'll be waiting until the incinerator falls apart from old age. So there are a lot of ways in which linking them is dangerous, especially because if you have the incinerator, you're probably in a contract that punishes you if you reduce waste by making you have to pay the incinerator anyway and pay to do the right thing. So it's important that our movement focuses just as hard on ending incineration as we do on zero waste in these communities, and have them be a dual track advocacy that doesn't link these ideas together. And as far as what a lot of governments and companies are doing in response, they call things zero waste to landfill. It's just something that you need to look out for. It's a public relations term that tries to take our language and use it against us by pretending that by burning trash like Subaru does at their stadium in Chester, Pennsylvania, and a Subaru company generally, they are burning their trash that's left over and claiming there's zero landfill, even though the ash still goes to a landfill. So that's not even honest. And you have a lot of companies, you've got Disney, a lot of car companies, some cities, all kind of using this zero waste to landfill rhetoric, which we need to really make clear is not the same thing as zero waste. So that's it. Thank you for sitting through all those slides. I'm going to take off the screen share now and see what questions we have.
Thanks, Mike. I'm gonna repeat what Neil put in the comments. What a great set of data to expose the contradictions and so many helpful comparisons for us to take a look at. And then later also said, you know, one of the most important things that community activists can do is to share this presentation with their local officials. So thank you so much for putting everything together so clearly, so concisely, with such good graphics and charts there. So yeah, we're going to open it up. We have a few questions in chat that I can ask out, but also please feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you and have some live dialogue as well. I'm going to start with the first question, Mike, is from Stephen Ledner. He says that funds from the IRA are a major source of Miami-Dade's funding for a new MBF. Will not refer to it as they will not refer to it as they are doing waste to energy. Are there alternative federal funds for a circular economy solution that doesn't involve an MBF?
Yeah, I'm going to assume that MBF stands for mass burn facility, but Stephen, please come off of mute and correct me if I'm reading that wrong.
You got it. You got it.
Okay. So mass burn facility is basically a type of trash incinerator. Most of them are the mass burn type. Steve, we're getting about go on mute there, but come off of mute if you're talking again. I'm sorry. So the term mass burn basically means that you're burning all the trash as opposed to doing refuse dry fuel where you pull out the metal and glass that don't burn and then you burn the rest of it, which is what Miami-Dade County used to do at the plant that burned down in February of last year. There is a lot of federal money available for what we sometimes call circular economy or zero waste solutions that don't involve burning, because no circular economy or zero waste solutions do involve burning, despite the efforts to hijack those terms. They're anathema to a zero waste system. And there are a lot of different grants available. I don't have them at my fingertips right now, but I can follow up and get that to you. There are PowerPoints that have been developed and lists of just different grant opportunities that local governments and counties and municipalities can tap into.
So if I could follow that up, so the county is depending on funds from the IRA to move forward with their waste to energy, as I said. So that we're just trying to find a funding. Yeah. So as you said, there are alternatives for zero waste, but also to discourage the county from utilizing these IRA funds to proceed with their mass burn facility.
Right. I think the bigger danger in Miami-Dade County financially is actually that the insurance from the incinerator having burned down, I think it's something on the order of $200 million.
Correct.
That insurance is only allowing the county to use that money if they're going to build a new incinerator. Unlike federal money, that if they apply for the right grants, they could finance a zero waste system instead of using that federal money for an incinerator. So that's the quandary I think you're in.
And part of that is it's the county stipulation that the monies be used, and we're looking for a workaround around that insurance money.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about it, Stephen, if you want to follow up later. Be a good conversation. Okay, see the next question I see in the chat is from Neil, and I see Neil has his hand up as well. Let me take what you had in the chat first, Neil, and then add to it verbally if you would. But on your question about the last one built in Florida, not Montgomery County, the last incinerator that was built at a new site was Montgomery County, Maryland. That was 1995. The last one that was built at an existing site is West Palm Beach, Florida. So that's the only one that's classified as new in terms of EPA. There are also some that have been expanded or rebuilt, like Hawaii, the Honolulu facility had a third burner built in 2013. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was totally torn down basically and rebuilt in 2006. So some of them are new-ish in those senses, but as far as like pick a new community and try to build one and can you do it, they have not been able to do that since 1995.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks, as I said before, for a terrific tour de force of the field. I put in the chat numbers of our best recycling communities, only to point up the fact that if you pay attention to real source separation, not automation, not centralization, you can reach extraordinary high rates of diversion. And that, of course, is in a context of a consumer society that's pushing us to buy things. And as Mike has described, a federal bureaucracy that's caught in inertia and contradictions. So it's not only possible that every community can get to these high rates, because what's going on in these various cities and counties is nothing, no magic. It's just source separation. That's it. And of course, product design and switching the investment patterns. But basically, when you handle garbage, and everyone handles it every day, the simple decision that we can get people to make, and they're doing it. So this is very real, and the fight against incineration is getting stronger and stronger. And finally, I agree with Mike that it's virtually impossible to build a new one, given the level of information, the level of activism, and the track record of shutting hundreds of these things down before they even get past the bonding stage. So thanks again, Mike. This is great.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for being such a great force for zero waste and fighting incinerators and lots of meetings with Neil, and it's a great resource. Next question I see in the chat is from Emily. It says, why is it that incineration / WTE, which I don't use that word unless I put in quotes, but why is it taking hold in Europe? It seems that it's more common there, and I hear they're often building new ones. And there's an answer on that from Rebecca that says they don't have much land, so incinerators are attractive. And so, yes, part of it is about land. Part of it's also policies that they have. that really discourage allowing unprocessed waste to go to landfills. And so they've had policies that they're now recognizing are misguided and have led them in a bad direction, overbuilding a lot of incinerators, some to the point where they rely on them for heating in Scandinavia in some cases so much that they're actually having to import trash from other countries to have enough just to keep their buildings heated. So I think they kind of went a little too far down that path and are trying to dial it back in more recent years. Thank you, Neil, for your answers to that as well. And anyone, feel free to raise your hand or jump in. I'm just trying to scan and find the questions here in the chat. Thank you. Yes, Marcia, go ahead and come off of mute.
Yes, so I've been watching the CERCLA guidance on with the hazardous waste declaration for PFAS. And I'm really interested in knowing the implications on the waste industry in general, some of the liabilities that are rising up. And trying to sort of process those within, does this benefit the arguments against incinerators? Are there traps that we should avoid? Because I know I've communicated to you that they're talking about proposing a second one here, and just sort of what your thoughts are with those declarations and the implications.
Right. I can't say I'm totally on top of that, but I know some of the things I've seen, for example, that sewage treatment plants and landfills are being classified as passive receivers of PFAS because they're not the ones producing it. They just get it when waste materials go down the drain or go into a landfill. And of course, these are connected industries because landfills have leachate that often goes to a sewage treatment plant that's not designed to handle it. So they're a second passive receiver of that PFAS that can then be discharged into our waterways, and then we can then have drinking water intakes downstream, and it ends up in our bodies because these industries are not being held accountable to limit the PFAS because they didn't make it, but it's going through them. So I think that's one of the big regulatory loopholes we need to watch out for. I know there have been issues with PFAS being found in incinerator ash and in leachate of leaking leaking landfills that are ash landfills, like the one in Brookhaven on Long Island. That's been a major issue. So that's about as much as I could share on that right now. But yeah, thank you for monitoring that, Marcia, and look forward to working with you on that. And I see a question from Rebecca. It says, I live in a fairly poor county that's looking at incineration. Are there models of similar places that have successfully implemented zero waste? And yes, there are a lot of them. I'm not going to try to rattle them off right now. I know Neil could easily do that, but let's follow up. I know Neil and I are in touch with you, Rebecca, and we can point you and anyone else interested to a number of different places that have done good zero waste plans, some of which are well into those plans. Most of the best models are going to be out in California and the West Coast or left coast. But yeah, there might be places that are more similar demographically to your community that we can point to. That would be good models as well. What else here? Okay, I see Tamala saying, I tried to get a pilot to collect household food waste to decrease greenhouse gases for the Climate Action Commission. They rejected this because they said it was negligible. This contradicts 30 greenhouse gas. I'm not sure what that means. Is from 30% of greenhouse gases in waste, I think, is from food waste. Is that, correct me, Tamara, if I'm reading that wrong? How do I counter and push? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So how do I counter and push for food collection in the municipality? One of the zero waste plans that I was a consultant as part of a team working on was in Montgomery County, Maryland. And that team had probably the best sub-team of composting experts in the country. There was Brenda Platt on it, Craig Coker, Nora Goldstein from Biocycle, and they are just some of the top people in the field. And there's an extensive set of recommendations on composting for Montgomery County. So that's one of the waste plans that I can make available to you. And you can just check out the composting section on there for lots of ideas, and then just see which ones are a good fit for your community. And if I can, I'll pull that link out and drop it in the chat before we're done here.
That would be fantastic.
Okay, I see a question from Rita. Our county is small. The county chair was told that there are now small incinerators which would fit our size. He thinks that it would be a silver bullet since our landfill is almost full. How to deal with that? And Rita, I'll just expose, is from Kauai. We've been working together on the zero waste crisis there, or actually a waste crisis there, because they're probably the only place in the country that will literally have no place to put their trash for 3 years if they don't really take quick, swift action now, between now and 2030, cutting their waste stream in half in that time. There are not really successful small incinerators. The small incinerators that are the conventional kinds in the US are not economical. No one wants to build at those sizes. When they do try to build new ones, it's at the 1,500 to 4,000 ton per day range. These small ones that are somewhere, but I think was Kauai about 250 tons per day. Is that, am I remembering
Yes.
right? So no one's building at that size. That's like at the very bottom of the scale of trash incinerator sizes. And those ones that at that size are being closed or sold off to others that close or have gone bankrupt, like the two in Western Massachusetts did about a year or two ago. And where they are keeping them open is because they're doing things like seeking medical waste or other exotic waste streams to burn that fetch a higher price because they just can't afford to operate at that small scale. And if they can't do that with the existing ones under old regulations, they are not going to be able to afford to do that with newer regulations that cost more for pollution control equipment. And the other types of incinerators like pyrolysis, gasification, they just simply don't work. They are small scale because they can't scale up because they don't work. But numerous places they've tried and they fall apart economically, financially, or technically, or both, or they end up switching to a more homogeneous feedstock, not trash, because they just can't operate on that. So I don't think they're being realistic when they say they found smaller ones
Mike,
that work.
Can I add something for a minute? The financing of these plants require large plants because the attractiveness of these plants to the financial system are the bonds. And in many cases over the years of fighting these things, we found out that the bond issue is the victory. Once the bond is issued, not only does Wall Street make their percentage, overall 15% of the bonds go to Wall Street and what we call financial patronage. That is consultants and energy experts and all kinds of expenditures that the incumbent politician, governor or mayor has to give out to his or her friends. And that is the if you will, the financial syndrome. It's a perverse syndrome that not only pushes these plants because you need more capital to build an incinerator than to recycle. Recycling is about 10% of the capital for an incinerator, and that's for a Cadillac system. So that momentum within the financial circles is one of the hardest connections to incineration to break, because these are very powerful companies on Wall Street, and politicians are greedy.
And Mike, do you know how long it takes to build an incinerator?
Usually it's about a 3-year time frame to build. More than that to permit and site and finance. So basically you have between now and 2030, and you're going to use all that time. If they speedily work on building a new facility, you might have one up and operating if no one fights it by 2030. And by that point, you'll have a waste facility that can destroy your materials and produce some kind of ash that has no place to go because you'll be out of landfill space. So you're still screwed with that plan anyway.
If I can just add, the politician who succeeded in getting the bond through will be long gone. He'll probably be retired or become a consultant to the waste energy and wasted energy industry.
Exactly.
So we won't have money and we won't have we won't have an incinerator when we run out of landfill space.
Yes, I think the biggest danger is they're wasting time and money that they can't afford to waste, and they need to be just getting very serious about zero waste right away, because cutting waste in half on average between this year and 2030 is not an easy thing.
And what the face of all of this are the bureaucrats who are wedded to the incinerator for their careers, and because some of them actually believe it makes sense. However, that's why I said in my comment, any city official that looks at this and then looks at their citizens straight in the face and says, we need an incinerator, you've got to vote against that person. And not only you, but your children have to vote against that person, because these things tend to go from on and on.
See a question from Tamara in the chat. How can we counter pyrolysis for biosolids? They claim it breaks up PFAS. There are some great resources from folks who are fighting that currently in the state of New York. Saratoga Biochar is a company that has been trying to do sewage sludge pyrolysis. I don't use the word biosolids. That's literally a PR company made up that term in a contest. But it's toxic sludge in most people's understanding, or sewage sludge. They just like to rename it. But that is not a viable option either. There are no ones commercially operating on that. I think there was maybe one at one point, and it didn't work out and it didn't stay open. There's some other places trying it, including a couple in my area in Pennsylvania. But generally that doesn't work and has a lot of problems with it as well. Whether it breaks up PFAS, I haven't seen the data on that, but considering that a trash incinerator can't destroy PFAS, a lot of it ends up released without being broken down, tells us something. There are technologies that can break it down, like supercritical water oxidation that has been used on chemical weapons that can cleave those carbon halogen bonds and safely put it into a liquid stream that you can then reprocess as many times as you need to after testing it to make sure it's clean enough to discharge into a water body. That is a safe alternative that doesn't involve burning. That's what we should be using for those sorts of things. See a question from Ed that says, what about the new proposal to use them for carbon capture? I have not heard any proposals to use trash incinerators for carbon capture. Adding carbon capture to an incinerator to reduce the much larger than coal type of or level of emissions of greenhouse gases that you get, 65% more than coal plants emit. To add carbon capture and sequestration to something that is already the most expensive way to manage waste or produce energy will make it many times more expensive. On top of that, there's just no way financially that's going to pan out. Maybe with massive government subsidies, they could get one in somewhere if they try to subsidize it to death, but honestly, that's just not a viable technology. And oftentimes when you do capture that carbon, it's used to inject underground where they're trying to extract oil, and they call it enhanced oil recovery, which means that the carbon dioxide comes back up with the oil, and then you get oil that you burn and create more CO2. So it actually is overall kind of making things worse and not improving the situation. So not a fan of carbon capture sequestration. We do have these wonderful things called trees that cost a lot less money and build themselves and can capture carbon without all the piping and crazy schemes that they have for that. Okay, I see another question from B that says, what kind of time frame do you see implementing zero waste in the majority of communities? Neil might want to add a bit to this, but I would say a lot of it is long-term, but the bigger arc of it can be done in the short term. There are major policies that if you adopt curbside composting collection, a deconstruction mandate to deal with construction demolition waste, the first priority actually should be the pay-as-you-throw system, the pay per bin and per bag, making sure they have mandatory recycling and composting and enforcement education to go with it and give people the bins they need. Put all those things in place in the first few years and you'll cut your waste in half in just a few years, I believe. And then it's that other half that's going to take a longer time to whittle down. Neil.
Great question. Let me start with a very brief anecdote, a great comment by Paul Connett, who many of you know is a terrific anti-incineration activist around the world and in the US. And in one of his talks, he makes fun of people who support incinerators and the bureaucracy, and he says they're boring. They're very boring. Go talk to them. They have nothing to talk about except incineration. Whereas you talk to a zero waste person, then you get a whole amazing interactions with all kinds of things. And having said that, the key to let me come back. I was started to write something, and I'll be right back.
I think we're out of questions I see in the chat. If anyone else has questions, want to raise their hand or just come off of mute, that would be fine.
Mike, it's Steve in Miami again. You had mentioned that it won't work to combine a fight against incineration with zero waste. Could you repeat that? I'm not sure I understood it correctly.
Yeah, the danger is, for example, in Montgomery County, Maryland, we ran into this. We had a promise from their county executive to close their incinerator that's county owned. And it was supposed to be closed over a year ago, according to the schedule that he put in writing himself. But at certain points earlier on, and then again more recently, as we find that this deadline is being allowed to slip by 5 years or more, they are claiming that, well, we'll close the incinerator once we get the amount of trash that we have to export to a landfill down to the same annual tonnage as the amount of ash that we currently, in that case, they export to a majority Black community near Richmond, Virginia. And so they think that they're all happily not using landfills, and here they are dumping on a Black community with toxic ash. And so this, instead of just switching to a less populated and a community that's not going to violate the Civil Rights Act to use, which is what we've been advocating, and then work on zero waste as quickly as they can, they're tying these ideas together, and they're making us wait on the incinerator closure, which is the biggest health impact from the waste system, is that they're burning their trash. So they should stop that immediately, but they're saying, nope, we're going to wait until all this zero waste stuff happens, and then we'll close the incinerator. It's just delaying many years the closure.
Got it. Thank you.
Mike, what I wanted to say before was that there are several plans, zero waste plans, that are now available. Mike and I will make them available in Montgomery County. Mike's work in Delaware. Mike also worked in Montgomery County. Mike also worked with me on Minneapolis, Hennepin County. And it's an intricate thing. There's a time frame, there's the pay-as-you-throw policy, all kinds of policies and a time frame for introducing them. And all of this has been laid out. Obviously, each community is different, but the framework, you could take a look and see what steps have to be taken to start implementing zero waste. At the same time, thanks to Mike's legal work, there are many legal steps you have to take to shut down an incinerator, and these are laid out as well. So Mike or I or others will make these reports available to you, and you could see the framework that you need for your own community, whether it's a small town, big town, or a rural area.
And I'm dropping all the links that I have handy into the chat here, so just save the chat and you'll have a lot of different zero waste plans to draw on. One of the questions I see from Nicole is how we convince local municipalities to implement zero waste plans or systems. And that's something that I highly encourage you to get in touch with someone like me or Neil, who has been part of zero waste consulting teams, who can help make sure it gets set up the right way. One of the things that I did is I got the right language into a request for proposals by Delaware County, Pennsylvania, to make sure that it said this is a zero waste plan that is following the zero waste definition and the zero waste hierarchy as codified by the Zero Waste International Alliance. That way there's no question whether there's some other zero waste hierarchy they just made up that they're going to look at, because there are a lot of consultants that usually get these contracts and they perpetuate the status quo. They love incinerators and they will be happy to take one of these contracts and not do anything good with it, as opposed to the way we designed it that made sure the right people got the contracts. Zero Waste Associates got it, put together a great plan, and it's just very detailed how you have to make sure the process leads to asking the right questions of the right people because if you screw up either part of that, you get the typical industry consultants hired, and it leads you in the wrong direction, which we're seeing in a lot of other places. Did I miss any questions? I think there might have been one more. Oh, something new. Thank you. You're welcome, Nicole. All right, any questions I missed or any new ones? Yes, Stephen. You're still on mute. Stephen, you're still on mute if you're talking.
I am so sorry. Our county has just issued an RFP seeking a consultant to oversee our zero waste program. How do we get that to credible consultants?
The answer is they already know about it because I've heard about it from them. So I know the credible ones are already aware of it. The big question is whether the county is going to pick the right people, because I've seen other ones where if they don't word it the right way to scare off the typical consultants that aren't going to go in the right direction, they will pick those folks because they probably get campaign contributions from them or just have relationships with them. Like in Broward County, just north of you with Arcadis, they always like to go to them for advice, and they get the pro incinerator advice every time. So I'd be really worried that they're not going to pick the right people, but the right people do know about it and will be bidding on it. And hopefully maybe it'll take some pressure, but maybe you can get them to hire the right folks.
I can add an anecdote to that. In Maryland, the various localities, the community groups wanted Ruth Abbey to bid on a zero waste contract, and the state solid waste management authority, which is basically the incineration authority, banned Ruth from being eligible to bid on a contract. Happily, Ruth has done many other projects, but that's the extreme that these people will go to keep competent alternative people out of the process.
Okay, Tamala?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what your thoughts were with Pennsylvania zero waste. I feel that the little that they have is sorely lacking and a lot more is needed. What are your thoughts? What should we be working on and pushing with? This is for Pennsylvania.
Well, if you're talking statewide, I'm not aware of any. I know there have been a package of bills that some have been pushing, but I'm not aware of any actually getting passed into law. So there are a lot of things that get talked about as zero waste, but I'm not aware of any actual policies or things in this state that are in that direction. Is not a leading state for that kind of thing. So I think really we should be looking toward what Delaware County is doing and will be unfolding as we get the zero waste plan finalized in the next year and hopefully implemented and funded in the next year. See how that plays out could be a good model to bring to other parts of the state. Okay, Star, I see your hand up.
Yes.
Oh, you just went on mute. Make sure you're unmuted. Star, you're still on mute. There you go.
I live in Sullivan County, New York, and about 2 years ago, they went from sorted recycling to the so-called single stream recycling, which was, in my opinion, a total disaster. Less than half of the stuff that was being sorted out to be recycled under the old system, it was just dumped in there and cross-contaminated, and it became worse. Now they're going to try to they're screaming about the landfill, and it's going to be closed, and we have to get something else. But they are looking very seriously at this waste to energy crap. And you know, you said, well, get the zero waste policy programs out there and have them put out an RFP to find that company that would do that. I don't think they're going to get anybody to do the zero. I mean, the bigger places have trouble getting a zero waste company to bid on the project. I don't think in Sullivan County that we're big enough to do that and then just turn around and say, we have no choice. We have to go with this. This is the only way to do it.
Okay, I'd like Neil to speak to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, Star.
Hi.
I'm pretty familiar with Sullivan County, and now I don't live that far. I live in the middle of New Jersey, and I'd be very happy to work with you and your, I assume, a group, for the citizens to do the research and put together a framework. It won't be a detailed zero waste plan, but it will be a framework that you folks can use as an alternative. There are just a lot of exciting things happening in rural areas in terms of recycling. And if I'm not mistaken, over the last few years, Sullivan County is not really that rural anymore. It's really filling up with a lot of people. So I'd be very happy to talk to you about working with you to do a citizens framework on zero waste for Sullivan County.
That would be wonderful. We actually have one of our legislators is fantastic. She's really on this. She's backing it to the hilt. I think that would probably be the most constructive way for you and she to get together with the other interested parties.
Yep.
How do we do that?
I will put my email in the chat and send me an email and we'll talk and set up a time for us to have a meeting.
Perfect. Thank you.
Wherever Mike is, because Mike travels far, much more than I do, maybe Mike could come into that meeting. If they're thinking of an incinerator, I think we could bring Mike in through Zoom or whatever, phone call, to have Mike impress upon them these numbers on health and cost with regard to incineration. But I'll put my email in the chat and we'll get together.
Yeah, let me also
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Star, for bringing that up. And the single versus dual stream, I just wanted to comment quickly on that because you're very right about that. A lot of places used to have paper separate from bottles and cans in the collection, and that kept things a lot cleaner so that they're more marketable. And a lot of places went for a single stream, so you can put it all in one bin with the idea that it's easier for more people to participate, so you get more material, but it's not as marketable, and a lot of it doesn't end up actually recycled when it's not as clean of a stream. Some places have stuck with dual stream though, like Montgomery County, Maryland, and found that they have that higher value and the economics of the recycling when they do that. And some places are actually looking at going back to dual stream for that reason. And Neil will be a great resource to learn about some of those places.
Yeah, Mike, let me point out the last community I know was South Orange, New Jersey, went from single stream to dual stream in the first year, which is a transition year, and it wasn't completely correct. They saved 81,000 for a number of reasons, which we can go into. But the reason why there was the switch in the late 90s, early 2000s to single stream was that the industry, waste management, BFI at the time, et cetera, grabbed control of city contracts by lowballing dual stream systems. I could go into detail. The bottom line is what they want, they could care less about recycling. They make 10 times as much more money on landfilling. But they had to have a solution. And their solution was to go to single stream, force cities to put it all together, ship it long distances to their mega processing plants. It's their financial plan to deal with recycling. There are many alternatives, and I'm trying to find a quote from Dan Knapp at Urban Ore, who really very pithy comment on why source separation, real source separation, is needed not only for the mechanicals and markets that Mike just mentioned, but it's for understanding about the world around you. And we need kids to compost in their backyard so they understand nature. And it's the same thing with recycling. Recycling is a tool to get people ready to live in a sustainable society, which we have a long way to go. But recycling is an icon. It was adopted early on in the 69, 70, and it took over and it stagnated. It reached 35% recycling in the country by 2000, and then industry took over and we're still at 35% because industry doesn't care. They're making money either way. This is like the financial connection to Wall Street. these are the types of things that we have to divert. We have to divert capital from the single stream systems so that cities can reestablish dual stream systems. I can provide very detailed essays on this if people are interested in that aspect of it.
Thank you, Neil. Any other questions or comments? Okay, it should be coming up now. Can you see it?
Yes.
Great.